I know what you're saying, preacher. I know what you're saying. You don't need to persuade me that sin is suicidal. I know it. And there's no hope for me. That's what verse 7 is about. That's what verse 7 is about.
How does justification sever the root of despair and free us from sin's power? In this episode of Light and Truth, John Piper opens Romans 6, 5-10 to reveal the liberating effects of being united with Christ. This sermon was originally preached at Bethlehem Baptist Church on October 5th, 2000.
Because the power of sin is broken, we know that we'll be raised with Him. Now, what does that mean? Does it mean that our sanctification, our triumphing over sin little by little, earns for us the resurrection? I don't think so. But it does, I think, very clearly imply there won't be any resurrection without sanctification. No resurrection unto life without sanctification. I think that is here in verse 6. Which raises this question for us. Wait a minute. I thought for 2 years you've been teaching us that justification, by faith alone, apart from any doings, obedience on our part, secures for us a right standing with God that can't be broken. And you're right. That's exactly what I've taught and believe is in Romans. So what's the relationship between justification and sanctification? And that's exactly the right question to ask, because that's the question Paul answers in verse 7. And all the English versions make it hard to see, to my dismay. In verse 7, he gives the reason for why it is that we will be freed from slavery to sin. And the verse says, "For he who has died is justified from sin." And all the English versions translate it, freed from sin. I don't think that's right. I think that just repeats the initial verse. Doesn't ground it. I think it needs a ground. In fact, I think it's wholly unwarranted to translate the word that 26 times in Paul's letters only means justify, reckon righteous, to translate it here in terms of a moral transformation. I think that's wrong. The moral transformation is in verse 6 for sure, and is absolutely necessary if we are to attain to the resurrection of the dead. If you have died, you've put off the old body of sin and you're freed from slavery to sin. Yes, that's essential if we're going to make it to heaven. There must be a change in direction in your life, not perfection. I'll be saying that over and over again in this chapter because it's so plain. Not perfection here, but a change in direction. A new liberty comes into the life, a hatred of sin, a commitment to do right, a growth in grace. This is essential if we are attained unto the resurrection. But now the question is, how does justification relate to the necessity of sanctification for the resurrection? And the answer is given in verse 7. For he who died has been declared innocent, acquitted, and just and righteous over against sin and from sin. Now, what that says in effect then is that the foundation of sanctification is justification. But there's more that can be said about that, giving warrant to it and explanation to it. I think it's simply superficial to say that because verse 6 is talking about a genuine liberation from moral sinning, that the ground clause in verse 7, which uses the standard word for justification, has to also refer to a moral liberation from sinning. I think that is absolutely superficial. And I think the superficiality comes from this: failing to ponder the nature of slavery to sin to its root. Think about this with me for a moment. This is very relevant, very practical to your life, especially if you struggle with depression or know somebody who does, or other situations that I'll refer to. What is it that holds us in slavery to sin? The answer to that question is not one thing, but two things, at least. One thing is the allurement, the powerful, deceitful allurement of sin as to be preferred over righteousness. So sin presents itself to the mind and the conscience and the will and says, do me and you will be happy. Lie and it will go better. Lust and it will feel good and there won't be any repercussions. Talk about yourself for a little bit and you'll get a little more praise and it'll feel so good. Sin is always commending itself to us with allurements, and we are enslaved to it because those allurements triumph in our will and in our hearts, and we don't have the wherewithal to see another alternative as more alluring than the allurement of sin. Now, if that's all that verse 6 were referring to, I would agree that verse 7 should mean, for we have been freed from sin. Because that's the only way you could get free from sin. It was this, with a moral transformation of the will, to be allured by other things more. That's not the usual meaning of justification. And highly unlikely that that is what it means. And so I ask, is there another way that sin holds us in bondage? I mean practical sin now. Practical, daily, keeping us from doing the right and leaning us to do what is wrong. Is there another power that holds us back from sinning? And I believe there is, and I believe it is deeper than the power of sin to allure by its satisfaction promises. It's deeper. And therefore it has to be fixed or solved first before any progress can be made with triumph over the allurement of sin. And what I have in mind is the guilt of sin that paralyzes and blinds to the fact that there can be any hope for me, a sinner, that I could even begin to be accepted by God and make any progress in triumphing over the power of sin in my life. I think the blinding despair of the guilt of sin is a deeper bondage to sin. Let me just illustrate for you. There are people who have grown up in the church, they know all the doctrine. And owing to the exceeding sinfulness of sin, give way to it entirely. And if you approach those people and watch this horrible work of sin ruining their lives and ask them, don't you see that the allurement of sin that is pulling you down is a lie? Don't you see that this behavior and this attitude and this spiritual orientation is absolute folly? It's going to destroy you. It's a dead-end street. Don't you see that? And have them say back to you, yes. And it doesn't matter, because there's no hope for me. That's a deeper bondage. That's not a bondage to the allurement of sin only. That's a bondage underneath the allurement of sin. Hopelessness. I could never get there. I could never get right with God. I am excluded. I could never be accepted. I could never be set right. I couldn't even get to first base so that there would be any resources to fight against the allurements. That bondage is way deeper. This is despair. This is absolute blank. I know what you're saying, preacher. I know what you're saying. You don't need to persuade me that sin is suicidal. I know it. And there's no hope for me. That's what verse 7 is about. That's what verse 7 is about. Justification, even after chapter 5, is the key not only to getting right with God, it's the key to sanctification. And if those two get mingled, there is no hope for anybody. This is a massive mistake that many are making today. The coalescing of sanctification into justification is a great tragedy in the Catholic Church and in other parts of the church today. Beneath the call to sanctification, which is an essential call, I believe that so deeply it makes this issue huge for me. There is a holiness without which nobody will see the Lord. Lived out holiness, not just justification. But it is not the same as justification. The ground of it, the ground clause of verse 7 supports the necessity of verse 6. And therefore what I have is news for the hopeless, that you don't have to get to a point of triumph over the allurement of sin before you get right with God. There is a reality, a distinct reality, a unique reality called justification, a declaration, a legal right that you, by falling on Jesus alone, called faith, gets you the righteousness of Jesus. From which position now you will little by little be granted the grace to grow in triumph over sin, which is what verse 6 is calling us all to, and what this chapter is really all about. So let me sum it up. In overcoming the power of sin, which is what this chapter wants. Shall we continue in sin that grace may abound? No, dead men don't sin. That's verses 1 and 2. Why don't they? Because if you have died, you've put off the old man and the body of sin, and you've been liberated from bondage and slavery to sin. For those who have died have been justified from sin. Justification is at the bottom. Sanctification is on top of it. And glorification is on top of that. And they come in that order. And they come with enabling both ways. Nobody is sanctified who's not justified. Nobody will be glorified who's not sanctified. No, to get this right, to get the gospel right is so crucial, both to win the hopeless to Jesus, to have a message for the most destitute, hopeless, depressed person, and to have a church that's not filled with carnal believers who think they're going to heaven and they live like the devil. There is a whole gospel, and it's all here in chapter 6. It's almost in every verse, it seems like. So we summarize like this. In verses 5 to 10, union with Christ in His death secures our eternal resurrection. That's stated in 5, it's stated in 8. By dying with Christ, we're united with Him in a resurrection like His, and we are secured. We're going to rise with Him. And He says, why? First argument in 8 to 10, because Christ has an indestructible life. And if you're united with Him, you have an indestructible life, and you're going to come out of the grave someday with a glorious body. And the second argument in verses 5 to 7 is God takes away the blinding despair of getting right with God underneath sanctification. And He makes us right with Himself by faith alone. And then on that foundation of verse 7, He builds verse 6. And our old body ceases to become the lackey of sin. And our old man dies and our new man comes alive. And little by little we grow in grace and are able to be freed from slavery to sin and make progress against the allurement of sin. Let's just take 1 minute in quietness as we close here. I'm sure there are people in this room who are so despairing of yourself. Would you please hear, this is good news, that the reason Paul has developed this argument that may seem complex is because your life is complex, as you know. And the bondage of sin has tentacles that are not just simple but complex. At one level, sin just feels good. It just feels good. And at another level, it feels suicidal. And yet you feel hopeless. That there's not even any point in trying to fight against it. And God has a remedy at every level of your life. God has a remedy for the human condition. And if yours is hopeless despair this morning, I plead with you to hear the offer of justification by faith alone, apart from sanctification. And let sanctification follow in due time, by the power of the Spirit, by the power of that wonderful resurrection hope streaming back into the present because we've been set right with God through dying with Christ. Just throw yourself in mercy on Jesus right now. You can do that. You can do that. Don't let Satan whisper into your heart. He won't accept you. That's a lie. That's not Jesus talking. Come unto me, all you who labor and are heavy laden. Ho, everyone who thirsts, come to the waters. Come, buy wine and milk without money and without price. You can't do anything for it. Just come, just fall. He will never turn anybody away who comes. And for those of you who are struggling at the allurement level, Take heart. Reestablish yourself by faith now on this glorious justification foundation. Think about the glory of resurrection. Think of what God is for you in Jesus now and in the age to come. And let the superior satisfaction of God give you victory over whatever you're struggling with today. Why don't you stand with me for closing prayer? Father, I beg of you that you'd let no one go out of this room despairing that there's no hope for them. Triumph right now with the gospel. The gospel is the power of God unto salvation for everyone who believes, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. For in it the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith. The righteousness of God breaking in, granting faith, resting on faith, sweeping in through faith will set you right with God. And now unto Him who is able to keep you from falling and to present you before the throne of His glory with rejoicing without blemish, to the only wise God be glory and authority and majesty and dominion before all time now and forevermore. And all the people said, Amen.
This is Light and Truth, God-centered preaching to help you see Christ clearly and treasure Him truly. I'm your host, Dan Kruver. Thank you for listening. On our next episode, John Piper continues our 12-part series, The Sanctified Life, with a sermon titled, Servants or Secret Agents. I hope you'll join us. For more resources, visit desiringgod.org.